The war was over. The Germans had occupied France, and the country lay quivering like a defeated wrestler under his opponent's knee. The first trains from the famished, suffering, despairing capital were making their way to the new frontiers, crawling across the countryside and through the villages. The first travellers were looking out of the windows at ravaged plains and burnt-out hamlets. At the door of every house that was still standing, Prussian soldiers in black helmets with brass spikes were sitting astride chairs, smoking their pipes. Others were chatting or doing odd jobs as if they were members of the family. Whenever a train passed through a town, the passengers could see whole regiments drilling in the main square, and in spite of the rumble of the wheels, hoarse words of command could be heard now and then. Monsieur Dubuis, who had served in the National Guard throughout the siege of Paris, was on his way to Switzerland to join his wife and daughter, whom he had prudently sent abroad before the invasion. Neither hunger nor hardship had reduced his pot-belly of a well-to-do, peace-loving tradesman. He had endured the terrible events of the past few months with sorrowful resignation and bitter comments on the inhumanity of man. Although he had done his duty on the ramparts and had mounted guard on many a cold night, it was only now, when the war was over and he was approaching the frontier, that he caught his first sight of some Prussians. He stared with mingled fear and irritation at these armed, bearded foreigners who had made themselves at home on the soil of France, and he felt in his heart a sort of fever of helpless patriotism, and at the same time that instinct of self-preservation, that newly acquired sense of prudence, which has never left us since. In the same compartment were two Englishmen who had come to France as sightseers and who looked at everything with calm, inquisitive eyes. They were both very stout, too, and chatted together in their own language, occasionally referring to their guidebook and reading out extracts aloud while trying to identify the places mentioned. The train stopped at a station of a little town, and suddenly a Prussian officer climbed the 2 steps into the carriage with a great clanking of his sword. He was a tall man, dressed in a tight-fitting uniform, with a flaming red beard up to his eyes. His face was cut in half by a pair of long mustachios, paler in colour, which stuck out on either side. The Englishman promptly began examining him with smiles of gratified curiosity, while Monsieur Dubuis pretended to be reading a newspaper. He sat huddled in his corner, like a thief faced with a policeman. The train moved off again. The Englishman went on chatting and looking for the exact positions of different battles. All of a sudden, as one of them was pointing to a village on the horizon, the Prussian officer stretched out his long legs, leaned back in his seat and said in very Teutonic French, "I killed 12 Frenchmen in that village. I took over 100 prisoners." The Englishman's interest was immediately aroused, and they asked, "Oh, really? What was the name of the village?" "Farsburg," replied the Prussian. He went on, "I took those French rogues by the ears." And he looked at Monsieur Dubuis, laughing proudly in his whiskers. The train crawled on, passing through more and more occupied hamlets. German soldiers could be seen on the roads, on the outskirts of meadows, standing by gates or chatting outside cafes. They covered the earth like African locusts. The officer stretched out his hand. "If I had been in command, I would have taken Paris, burned everything, killed everyone. No more France. Out of politeness, the Englishman replied simply, "Oh, really?" He went on, "In another 20 years, the whole of Europe, every bit of it, will belong to us. Prussia is stronger than all the rest." The Englishman, feeling a little uneasy, made no further reply. Their faces had become expressionless and looked like wax masks between their long side whiskers. Then the Prussian officer burst out laughing. Still lying back in his seat, he sneered at France, insulted his prostrate foe. He sneered at Austria, defeated a few years before. He sneered at the fierce but futile defence put up by the provinces, at the French militia, at the ineffectual artillery. He declared that Bismarck was going to build a city of iron with the captured guns. And suddenly he pushed his boots up against the thigh of Monsieur Dubuis, who flushed to the roots of his hair and looked away. The Englishmen seemed to have become oblivious to everything, as if they had suddenly found themselves shut up within the confines of their island, far from the din and clamour of the world. The officer took out his pipe and, looking straight at the Frenchman, said, "Have you any tobacco on you?" "No, monsieur," replied Monsieur Dubuis. The German went on, "Then go and buy some when the train stops." He added with a laugh, "I'll give you a tip." The train whistled and slowed down. It passed the burnt-out buildings of a station and came to a stop. The German opened the door and took Monsieur Dubuis by the arm. "Go and do what I told you," he said, "and be quick about it." The station was occupied by a detachment of Prussian troops. More soldiers were standing behind the wooden barriers looking on. Monsieur Dubuis jumped down on the platform, and despite the gesticulations of the station master, clambered into the next compartment. He was alone. His heart was pounding so wildly that he had to unbutton his waistcoat. He mopped his forehead, panting for breath. The train stopped again at another station. Suddenly, the officer appeared at the door and entered the compartment, followed by the two Englishmen who were actuated by curiosity. The German sat down opposite the Frenchman, and still laughing, he said, "So you refused to do as I told you?" "Yes, monsieur," replied Monsieur Dubuis. The train moved off again. "I'll cut off your moustache," said the officer, "to fill my pipe." And he stretched out his hand towards the Frenchman's face. The Englishman, as impassive as ever, watched intently. The German had already caught hold of the moustache and was pulling at it when Monsieur Dubuis struck up his arm with the back of his hand and, seizing him by the collar, flung him down on his seat. Then, mad with rage, his temples swollen and his eyes suffused with blood, throttling the Prussian with one hand, he started punching him furiously in the face with the other. The Prussian struggled wildly, trying to draw his sword and to get a grip of his adversary, who was lying right on top of him. But Monsieur Dubuis pinned him down with the bulk of his belly and went on punching him without pausing to draw breath and without knowing where his blows were falling. Blood flowed freely while the German, choking and gasping for breath, spat out broken teeth and struggled in vain to shake off the infuriated fat man who was pummeling him. The Englishmen had stood up and drawn nearer to get a better view. They stood watching, full of delighted curiosity, ready to lay a bet on one or other of the combatants. Then, all of a sudden, exhausted by his exertions, Monsieur Dubuis stood up and resumed his seat without saying a word. The Prussian was too astounded, too numb with astonishment and pain to fling himself on his adversary. When he had got his breath back, he said, "Either you give me satisfaction in a pistol duel, or I shall kill you." Monsieur Dubuis replied, "Whenever you wish." "We are just coming into Strasbourg," said the German. "I will find 2 officers to be my seconds. There will be just enough time before the train leaves again." Monsieur Dubuis, who was puffing as hard as the engine, said to the Englishman, "Will you act as my seconds?" And they both replied at the same time, Oh, yes, yes." And the train stopped. In less than a minute, the Prussian had found 2 brother officers who fetched a pair of pistols, and they all set off for the ramparts. The Englishmen, worried in case they should miss the train, kept pulling out their watches, quickening their pace, speeding up the preparations. Monsieur Dubuis had never held a pistol in his life. He was positioned 20 paces from his opponent. And then he was asked, "Are you ready?" As he was replying, "Yes, monsieur," he noticed that one of the Englishmen had opened his umbrella to protect himself from the sun. A voice gave a word of command. "Fire!" Monsieur Dubuis fired straight away, without waiting to take aim, and was amazed to see the Prussian standing in front of him stagger, throw up his arms, and fall forward on his face. He had killed him. "Oh, I say!" exclaimed one of the Englishmen in a voice quivering with delight, gratified curiosity, and joyful impatience. His companion, who still had his watch in his hand, seized Monsieur Dubuis by the arm and hurried him off at a run in the direction of the station. The first Englishman marked time as he ran along, his fists clenched and his elbows tucked into his sides. A 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. All 3 trotted along in line, regardless of their paunches, like 3 grotesque figures in a comic paper. The train was just moving off. They jumped into their carriage. The Englishmen took off their travelling caps, waved them in the air, and shouted 3 times, "Hip, hip, hooray!" Then, one after another, they solemnly shook hands with Monsieur Dubuis and sat down again, side by side in their corner of the compartment.